I want to talk about the update on the hospital blast. What had happened, if you remember, was that the hospital, the Al-Ali hospital, there were reports that it had been bombed by the Israelis, that 500 people were killed. Many of us assumed that meant the hospital. Well, we heard reports from inside medical professionals, Doctors Without Borders. There's also Israeli spokespeople that came out initially. Their social media spokesperson initially came out confirming that the hospital had been struck, saying, oh, it's a tragedy. Too bad Hamas hides in the hospital. There were doctors there that said the hospital had been struck right in the center of the hospital, that it wasn't adjacent to the hospital, that the hospital itself was struck. Um, then the fog clears and we find out that it was there's still quite a few casualties on that one. We're not 100% certain of the numbers on that. There's a lot of questioning of Hamas's numbers, but The Intercept recently did a piece where they fact checked the numbers that Hamas gave and the names on the list that Hamas gave to several other organizations. They also looked for the names of people that they knew were killed, and they found less. They had confirmed deaths, and some of the names that they had they did not find on the register. So they concluded that in some instances, Hamas is undercounting the deaths, that they're not getting everybody on these lists. But these lists have been shown by international fact checkers and other organizations to be pretty accurate lists, that Hamas is not inflating its numbers. But when it comes to the hospital blast, the Al-Ali hospital blast, there's a lot of a lot that is just not quite clear on this. Hamas says that 471 people were killed. Others claim, if you read other sources, they'll say, oh, no, that number is closer to 50 or it's close. But certainly what we do know is that 8,500 people have been killed throughout Gaza. New York Times initially reported that Israel had struck the hospital. They then retracted later and said, we're sorry for relying on Hamas for that information on their ministry, their Palestinian health ministry, which is run by Hamas. Sorry for relying on what they said. Others came out saying, actually, it was just a misinterpretation from the get-go, that Hamas had said that there were 500 casualties, about 500 casualties, and people interpreted that as death when actually it could be injury or death. So there was a lot of confusion there. It turned out when the fog settled that it was a parking lot that was hit. Then people wondered, how could there be so many deaths in a parking lot? Well, it turned out that a lot of the people that were evacuating, that had moved from the north, that were moving, trying to get out of their homes or their houses had already been bombed, they were there in the parking lot. It was kind of like a place where these refugees were gathering, and that's why there were so many people there. And that's why when it was hit, it ended up causing a lot of casualties. Now, the IDF came out saying, we have proof and let us show it to you. There's proof that this actually was a failed rocket from the Islamic Jihad. So they didn't blame it on Hamas, but they also didn't take ownership of it either. They said, no, it's this other militia group, and they fired it from behind the hospital. And there's a cemetery back there, and they fired this rocket off from behind the hospital, and it failed, and it fell down from the sky, and it instead hit these people, and it was the Islamic Jihad. That was who it was. Then they later on came out with a video and they said, see, this is the evidence of it. But the video showed the rocket coming from a completely different direction than the cemetery behind the hospital. So it was already really suspect there that you said it was coming from behind the hospital, but you show us a video of it coming from somewhere else. So because there was no evidence of a rocket being fired from behind the hospital, there was lots of cameras that were live that night in the direction of that hospital, and none of them caught anything like that. The one thing that was caught on camera that looked like it failed was coming from a different direction, and Israel looked at that and said, that's the one, that's the one. So then they were saying, well, okay, maybe it didn't come from the cemetery, but it came from somewhere else in Gaza. So there's a lot of confusion on this one, on what actually caused this blast. Well, the New York Times visual investigation team, alongside, they got this idea somewhere else, by the way. We're going to go over what their investigation showed, but they got this idea actually from other independent visual investigators who had whose jobs, there's actually this one organization where their job is to just count. They don't editorialize. They don't say anything about how they feel about anything. This is just a group that literally counts and uses numbers, and they're just saying, this is how many tanks have been. What they're doing right now, their task right now as an organization, is to track the vehicle and military losses in this war with Israel. So they're kind of a data science centric organization. And one of those guys from that organization analyzed the footage from a variety of videos and was able to actually pinpoint where this rocket came from that Israel used as the video evidence of the rocket failing and hitting the hospital. This is a video there. So this is a video. They said that's the rocket. And there it goes, falling from the sky, hitting the hospitals with their, because then moments later, there's the blast at the hospital. There it is. And they say, see that? That thing failed, hit the hospital, and that's the one. So the New York Times team took this investigation that was done by this other organization, and they went deeper into it to figure out if that was accurate. And let's go ahead and go over what they discovered. They discovered that the IDF's video, that rocket, absolutely, without a doubt, well, they say, they can't say without a doubt 100%, but they could say 99% that came from one of the Iron Dome sites in Israel, that was an Israeli rocket, that's what that was. That was an it was one of from their Iron Dome that's supposed to intercept. It was an Iron Dome interceptor is what it's called. And they said that's what it was. And it came from Israel, and they were able to pinpoint exactly where from the Iron Dome it came from. And they said the only reason why they can't give a 100% conclusion on that is because they don't have a fragment of the actual rocket. They also said that that's not the one that hit the hospital. So they said two things. First of all, the rocket shown in the video, they were able to conclude is an Israeli rocket. Secondly, they were also able to conclude that rocket did not hit the hospital, that rocket failed 2 miles further away from the hospital. So this is not the one that caused the damage. And that's all they concluded. They're not concluding anything more than that. They do not know what hit the hospital. They don't have any evidence of whether or not it was a failed rocket from the PIJ. They don't know if it was a failed rocket from Hamas, and they don't know if it was failed rocket from Israel, or if it was a targeted strike from Israel, or even a targeted strike from one of the other groups. They don't know what hit the hospital, but what they know is what the IDF uses as evidence, as surefire evidence, that it was a Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It was a PIJ or a Hamas rocket, failed rocket that hit the hospital. They're saying, no, that's not accurate. What we know is that's not accurate. So in the end, we don't know anything. We still don't know anything, but we know that the evidence the Israelis has presented is not accurate. So here is the thread from the, let me just go over this. Let me find the tweet stack for you. So this is Eric Toller with the New York Times visual investigations found. So they said Israeli and U.S. intelligence officials believe that a projectile captured on video shortly before the Ali Arab Hospital explosion was a Palestinian rocket. But New York Times visual investigations found that this object was launched from Israel and likely unrelated to the deadly blast. Okay. They go on to say an IDF spokesperson, and you can see the video. These are various video angles of that same exact rocket. So they were able to geolocate it based on the various different video footage they received, where those cameras were placed, and they were able to geolocate it. So they said an IDF spokesperson, if you remember, went on CNN and BBC with a printout screenshot from Al Jazeera live stream showing this projectile, claiming it was the rocket that hit the hospital. We also believe that American officials are incorrectly assessing this to be a Palestinian rocket. We geolocated 5 videos that showed this projectile launched from the north, south, east, and west. By drawing lines of perspective, 3 of which can be seen here, we assess that this project was launched from near the Israeli city of Nahal Oz. We cannot say with confidence what exactly this projectile is, but we know that there's at least one Iron Dome launch site in nearly that same location that overlaps from the sight lines we drew from the 5 videos. This site was still present in satellite imagery this year. So they believe that site exists, it was there, and that's where the lines led them. This projectile may have been launched in reaction to barrages of rockets from Gaza. A timeline, they said the Palestinian rocket barrage, so they were firing off rockets. And, the Palestinians fire off a bunch of rockets because they know there's that Iron Dome. So they're trying to fire off as many as they can. That's why you see so many coming out of Gaza. They do this as a strategy fire off as many as they can. They hope that the Iron Dome interceptors, they know they're going to get some of them, but they hope one's going to sneak through. That's why they do this kind of like massive barrage, because they know that they're up against the Iron Dome. So this projectile may have been launched in reaction to barrages of rockets from Gaza. A timeline, the Palestinian rocket barrages followed shortly by an Israeli projectile launch. So the Israelis, once they started getting the firing from Gaza, they started firing their own rockets. 17.5 seconds in the air before the projectile detonates, and then there's an explosion at the hospital 7 seconds later. That's why the Israelis are like, see, this is the one. It's there, it detonates in the air, and then it falls, and there's the hospital gets blown up 7 seconds later. About 25 seconds passed from the last Palestinian rocket fired an Israeli projectile to the hospital explosion. So there's no visual evidence that we have found that directly links these events to the blast at the Al-Ali Arab Hospital. The projectile launched from Israel detonates at least 2 miles from the hospital, and 25 seconds passed from when the final Palestinian rocket was launched in these videos and the hospital explosion. So they say the situation in the area around the hospital was chaotic that evening. That Al Jazeera live stream of the scene plus other videos were reviewed shows at least 2 large explosions near the hospital in the minutes before the deadly blast. You can see those blasts. I think there might be another one that happens. You can see that black smoke. And there's the other one. So the IDF told the Times that it was striking Gaza City that evening, but said that it was not in the area that would endanger the hospital. 3 days before the blast, a 155 millimeter illumination shell, commonly used by the Israeli military and not used by Palestinian militias, was fired into the Al-Ali hospital. Hospital administrators say that they had received warnings from the IDF telling them to evacuate. So the Israelis 3 days before did hit this hospital. And when they hit this hospital with this 155 illumination shell, you could see it didn't cause a big crater. It didn't collapse the building, right? I mean, it did, but it hit the hospital and it did damage. And they'd been told, we're going to hit you. We're going to hit you. We're going to hit you. Says our analysis does not answer what actually did cause the blast or who was responsible, but it does undercut one of the most publicized pieces of evidence used by both American and Israeli officials. So read our investigation below. Amazing work. And he gives all of his thanks. So he's saying right there, our analysis does not answer what actually did cause the blast or who was responsible, but it does undercut one of the most publicized pieces of evidence used by both American and Israeli officials. So, and many other experts have read over this and they have agreed. They've looked at the footage and they've said, yeah, this is that particular projectile that the Americans and the Israelis are pointing at as evidence definitely did not come from Palestine. That came from Israel. But based on what they saw, it also didn't hit the hospital. So it's still we do not know what happened. But what we do know is that Israel had been giving them warnings to get out, that we're going to bomb you. We do know that 3 days earlier they did bomb them. And we do know that the Israelis have a history of hitting hospitals, including that exact hospital 3 days earlier. We also know that there are a lot of failed Palestinian rockets, that these are homemade rockets. They're not that great and they fail. So we do know that happens. However, we also know that their homemade rockets, whether they work perfectly or they fail, don't kill that many people. They're not that powerful. So for them to wound or kill hundreds of people, even in a crowded parking lot, that still is also pretty questionable considering the type of rockets that they use. I mean, these guys, when their rockets don't fail, their rockets maybe kill 1 or 2 people. So when they fail, maybe it would have had to hit something else that would have then caused a larger, and we saw in the video kind of 2 looking like explosions coming from that hospital area. So it's possible, but that's the thing. We don't really know. We still don't know. But this idea that's been circulating around of, well, you guys were all wrong, and fanning the flames. and you guys were all wrong. And this is the truth. The truth is it was a failed rocket from the PIJ. Well, that's not true either. Nobody knows. We still just don't know who hit that hospital. What we do know is that the Israelis are absolutely bombing Gaza, and that friendly fire does happen. Friendly fire does kill people. I do believe that there have been a lot of people in this conflict that have been killed by friendly fire on both sides. That is normal. That happens. The odds of that not happening would be next to impossible, because in war, that's just what happens. Um, but that's the thing. There needs to be some sort of an agreement, a negotiation. There's a lot of Israelis on the streets protesting. Michael Tracy's on the ground. They're in Israel right now, and he's been reporting that a lot of people are protesting the Netanyahu government. They're wanting a prisoner swap. They're wanting a hostage swap. There were a lot of people who were from Gaza on a day permit working in Israel. They are not back in Gaza. These are innocent people that were just working regular jobs in Israel as the laborers, and they have not been returned to Gaza either. But there's been no reports on who they are, and there's been no calling out, or at least just even labeling them hostages. What are they if they're not hostages? If they were just laboring around in Gaza and they get rounded up and they're not being returned. So a lot of people are calling for a hostage swap. That's what they want. And they want, a lot of Israelis are calling for this, and they want a peaceful resolution to this conflict, and they want Netanyahu out, and then they want to deal with it. There's a lot of people still all in for war. There's a lot of people who still just want to have some sort of final, just they want Hamas gone, and they want the Palestinians gone as well. It's a very tough situation for both sides over there, for sure. The Palestinians are living in a blockade in one area, an occupation in another, and it's really atrocious.